So I'm really enjoying working on this basic joinery, and today I want to work on a HalfLap mitered joint. So what is that? So mitered joinery is where we have a corner and it has a miter in the middle, right? Now miters on their own are just a butt joint, not inherently very strong. Now there's different ways you can reinforce that with splines, you can even add dowels. But another option is to make the mitered joint inherently stronger by adding a HalfLap section to it. Now from the front of it, it's going to look like a miter joint, like a classic miter joint. From the side, you're going to see the HalfLap part a little bit, which personally I really like, because I love when you can see how the joinery is actually, like how it's put together. Where would you use a joint like this? Well, the obvious answer to that is like a picture frame. So let's say we want to make a frame for something like this. I have some beautiful maple here. This is actually a bit on the thicker side, and when you make this joint, it's easier to make it with wood that is a little bit thicker. Let's get our bench hook. We're gonna need marking gauge, a saw, maybe that's a knife, a chisel, one of these. Okay, so first of all we want to mark out our pieces. So HalfLap just means like one laps on top of the other, right? And we remove half the distance from this, half the distance from this, and they'll combine into like the same thickness. Okay, so we want to put one on top of the other. But for this joint here, we want to add a little bit of a distance. First, we're going to add 1/16 of an inch. Okay, and now let's put this piece and we'll make a mark. Now let's do the same thing on the other. We obviously want to do this square, right? Okay, I have a combination square here. This right here is 45 degrees. So if we put this right on our edge there, we get a perfect 45 that we can make our mark on here. Now, after you mark the one, the thing is you need to mark the other piece at an opposite angle. We need to put them like they will be at a corner, and this one is going to be opposite. So instead of going this way, this one is going to be that way, and that way they'll connect. So now they look the same. This part right here, where you have different angles and they come together in different ways, this is what's going to trip you up, if anything, right? And that's why you want to really mark out everything well ahead of time. So you know where you're supposed to cut and where you're not supposed to cut. And ask yourself, does this make sense? Do these go together in a correct way? If you put them side by side, they look like a mountain and they're opposites, but they're going to be like this, and in which case they match. They're the same. So now we want to mark the halfway point of the wood. A continuous line. And this is one of those joints that initially when you see it on a piece of paper, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That doesn't seem that difficult. It's a simple concept. It's a HalfLap, but at an angle. But then when you're actually starting to do it by yourself, it's not, you can get confused. It's not out of the realm that it gets confusing. It's going to look like a miter, but it's really not going to be a miter. We're still gonna have the whole piece is gonna interact here. So let's think here now, what do we need to remove? We need to remove this section, and we need to remove this section. The two pieces are going to be cut slightly differently. Let's mark them so we don't mess them up. So we have piece A and we have piece B. So I always like to make my marks with a knife because we're gonna have to cut. So piece A here, we're gonna cut this section here, and we're gonna cut it here. And I'm trying to cut to the right of the line, just slightly. I've come to appreciate lately just how fine a Japanese saw is in terms of the blade is so thin. I just feel like you have a lot more control in some ways. Of course the blade is very flimsy on the other hand, so you got that. But I love how fine the cut is and how you basically have no curve to deal with. Or very, very small anyway. Okay. So pretty crisp, So piece number 1, and the crispness here, I mean, it's rather important here because this is what's going to determine if the miter is clean or not. So for piece B here now, we're going to cut a little bit differently. We're actually going to remove the whole back piece, and we're going to remove this piece. And then of course we need to remove this section next. So I'm gonna put this guy back under here for support. Bent this saw a little bit now, which is what happens with these super thin saws and why they're difficult and don't last as long. There's a little bit of extra distance here. Remember that 1/16 of an inch there? When we did our measuring, it makes it easier to cut here when you're not right on the edge. I mean, you are on the edge, but you need that space there to complete the cut. Because then you get a super nice sharp kind of line there. So I reached my level here, so I'm going to start cutting into there. So let's clamp this piece of wood down to the bench instead. Okay, so we got that off. I would say that's pretty neat actually. Let's see what we got. Oh, look how beautiful. I mean, it's quite perfect really, this joint. It looks beautiful. It looks like a mitered joint, right? Unless you look at it from the side, and then you will see that there is like you know, there's joinery there. So that needs to be removed. Although I would probably prefer to first glue this in place and then plane this down once it's assembled. So found smaller painting. Turns out I have enough wood to make a frame for an 8x8 but not a 10x10. Okay, so we have the canvas is 8x8 and the distance here, including the 16th inch edition, is 1 1/4. Of course, your distance here is going to vary depending on the thickness of your wood. And on this wood here we have some burn marks. We'll remove that with a card scraper later. In some ways the length of these doesn't really matter exactly, since there's going to be a little bit of an overhang. The only thing that matters really is our measurement here. From the corner, 8 inches here, 8 inches there. And the other thing I was just kind of debating about is where should each one be. So I think I'm going to do AA, BB, BB, AA. It doesn't really matter, right? I mean, you could do it either way, as long as they match. Kind of funny how joinery like this is 99% marking everything right and then just following your own marks, right? A frame like this, if you do a frame, it shows up pretty badly if it doesn't quite line up. This is what we're gonna remove. This one was not quite as neat as that one. I have a little ledge here, but then, you know, that's where chisels are for, right? So we can just clean that up. We can always fine-tune a little bit more later when we assemble it. We have one of the pieces, both sides, complete. So I'm just checking this here now, and I can see that it's a little bit risen. So it goes up a little bit, so I need to remove a little bit more here. So now with 2 pieces done here, I can kind of check them and where we're at. This one's perfect. And this one needs a little work. I have a little bit of a gap there that could be cleaned up a little bit. 2 joints left to do here, so let's just line those up and make them. So super rainy day today. Your tolerance level, right, for failure, like how close does it need to be? I mean, pretty damn close, right? Especially when you are dealing with mitered corners. It is such a visual thing if there's a gap. I mean, in general, I'm not a stickler for perfection. I think whatever. If it's not absolutely perfect, it's not the end of the world. At the same time, you do want it to look decent. You know what, that joint needs to be cleaned up a little bit first. See, that's the thing. Before I make my final adjustments, I want to make sure the joiner that I have right now is actually quite perfect, so that I don't work off of the wrong information, if you know what I mean. So let me like trim up all my joints and make sure they are up to par. Of course, the tricky part with the chisel, when you are trying to, because here you want it square, and with a chisel like this, it can sometimes be hard to accomplish that perfectly, because you can always use the blade to kind of see if you're getting any kind of unevenness and make sure you go all the way through, so you get that perfect straight line, because that's what's going to kind of create visual holes later on if it's not quite a straight line. And I also check my bevel here, not quite 45s. We need to come down just a little bit right there, because that will affect the angle of the whole joint. It's funny with the project like this. You start cutting the joints, and the joints they go pretty well, and you're like, this is pretty fast. It's doesn't, you know, it's moving along really well. But then of course it's the finicky. One corner isn't quite perfect. You adjust that corner just a little bit, then the other corner isn't quite perfect, and that's the way it goes, right? So there comes a point where you just have to say, this is good enough. It looks pretty good. Now, if we were working with traditional mitered joints now, I would be a little worried because we didn't have a whole lot of glue surface to work with. But that's not the case here now. We have a lot of glue surface to work with. And this is really the beauty of this joint, right? Just the strength you get from it. You don't have to think like, oh, okay, end grain to end grain. Now we have a lot of side grain here too. We don't just have end grain we're working with. Okay, so let's... Obviously we can use these, so any little gap too, we can always add a little sawdust later. Okay, so now we have our corner right here. A couple days have passed and I have a cold, sorry about that. But so with this section right here, we could obviously saw it off if we wanted to. We could use a chisel, or we can use a block plane. So let's set up our plane for a kind of a narrow cut to begin with, get a feel for things. Sometimes with end grain I find it a little bit easier to just use a chisel too. So frame all done. I think it turned out pretty good. Let's see, I've got it actually turned out to be a pretty snug fit here for an 8-inch canvas. So it doesn't even need a groove or anything else. It's held in place just perfectly. So I'm just working on sanding the corners a little bit, but I think that they are pretty tight. Of course, if you turn the frame around, I mean, there are no miters. If we look at the side, we have these HalfLap. So kind of an ingenious joint, right? Where you have that look of the miter corner, yet the strength of the HalfLap. joint with all that glue surface. And kind of interesting when you look at the frame too, because it, you know, kind of has two different styles, and you have to take a moment and think about it. Like, how does that actually work? How is that put together that way? So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. I want to say a big thanks to our patrons for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it because I can take and do these kind of joinery videos. These are not sponsored. I'm just doing these because I really like doing the stuff, and it's kind of fun to dive into something, and it's because of the support from patrons that I'm able to do that kind of thing. So if you want to also encourage this kind of work moving forward, you can check out the link in the description to provide support if you want. Other than that, I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you soon. Now we just have to paint something on this guy, huh?